Welcome to the Demeere podcast. We talk about martial arts, self-defense, and a whole lot more. And now your host, Demeere.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the podcast. I have an exciting show for you guys today because I finally managed to get somebody on the show that I wanted to invite for the interview for a long time, Mr. Iain Abernethy. Iain, how are you doing?
I'm very good, thank you, Wim. Thanks for inviting me on.
It's a pleasure. And just for the listeners, Iain is in the UK. I'm in Belgium. There's a little bit of lag between us in the Skype connection. So if you feel that it's a little bit awkward, sometimes the silences, that's just the internet doing its thing and relaying our voices to each other. So don't worry about that. Okay. Iain, I'm just going to get right into it because, as you know, we have a bunch of questions to get to that I think the listeners will find very interesting to hear your responses about. So first off, could you give a little bit of a background on, how you started in your training, what you've been doing, what you've been up to, and so on?
Yeah, no problem. So I started when I was around 11 years old. Friends at school were doing karate. Like a lot of 11-year-old kids, you get into your fair share of fights and scrapes. So I decided, this should probably be good at this. So around about the same time as well, I think Enter the Dragon aired on TV, and then obviously my world went martial arts nuts. So I decided, I'm quite a quiet kid, so I decided, okay, I'll try and learn martial arts from, I'll get some books and read up on it. And of course, all the books tell you that you can't learn martial arts from a book. So I thought, I've got to go along to some classes. So I went along to the classes that my friends had gone to. So it was under a guy, Doug James, who's an 8th dan in Wadaroo Karate, and that was my first class. I hated it. I got punched in the stomach and dropped and just thought, this isn't for me. Went back to the second one, though, and loved it. Just really, that's when the bug kind of hit. So that was my initial beginning. So I think nowadays I'm probably better known for the Bunkai kind of work. So as I progressed, the kata was always fascinating to me. The self-defense side of things, the application, the use of it was something I always found fascinating. So I think those two interests kind of bled together a little bit. So it was natural for me to kind of pursue those elements. As a result of that, I've done some cross-training in judo to improve the grappling side of things. I also started training under Jeff Thompson, probably well known to most of your listeners, I think. Big influence on the self-defense thinking in the UK, and training under Peter Considine as well. I'm still training under Peter on a regular basis to bring, more of the reality-based side of things into what I was doing, and then kind of develop my own approach to the traditional arts, which, has proved relatively popular with people. So I've shared a lot of it via, Facebook and YouTube and podcasts and things like that. So that's currently where I am.
Okay. And if I'm not mistaken, so you're teaching full time now?
Yeah, I've been for about the last 12 years. So about 12 years ago, it became apparent to me that I didn't have enough time in the day to do all the things I wanted to do. So I talked to Jeff Thompson. I was saying, I just can't keep up. There's not enough hours in the day. And he just said, well, quit your job. And I kind of laughed and then, oh, serious? He means quit your job? And then I kind of left that training session. I thought, so, yeah, well, maybe, I could make a living at it. So I did the maths and worked out that I effectively couldn't. There wasn't enough money being generated by the martial arts side of it. But I just decided, okay, if I take a leap and I've got more time to apply to it, I might be able to, fulfill my first love of doing martial arts full time and also make sure that I can provide for me and mine in the process. So that's what I've been doing. For the last 12 years, I've been full time at it.
Yeah. That's pretty awesome because I know what it's like. Obviously, I'm a personal trainer, so I've been teaching martial arts for I think about 25 years now, actually, because I started really young. And I remember when I started as a self-employed teacher, when my friends would tell me like, dude, you're going to be bankrupt in about a year. You can never make a living out of this. And you're going to be unemployed. And I'm like, okay. So, and we're almost 30 years later now. So I'm really happy that you could do the same thing and follow your dream, basically.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's sometimes in the early days in particular, it was quite a precarious existence. You didn't know. Literally, it was at times. Okay, I need a seminar booking soon, or I'm not going to be able to pay the mortgage this month. But now, thankfully, I'm lucky enough that I know I've got about a year's worth of work ahead of me, and it's a real joy just to spend. It's not a great way to make money, but martial arts is a great way to spend your time. So if you can make money while you're doing it, and I can, means that I've got more time to devote to the things that I love doing. So, yeah, no, it is. It's an interesting life. It's an enjoyable way to make a living. Certainly beats being an electrician anyway.
Yeah, I can only agree with that. And speaking of, so you mentioned it already, and I think that's the first topic that we might want to tackle. So you mentioned Bunkai. Could you explain what Bunkai is for the people who aren't familiar with Japanese martial arts?
Yeah, no problem. Well, the word Bunkai literally means something like to chop into little pieces to gain understanding or to analyze. So that's what the word means. But in karate circles, it tends to mean the applications of the traditional form. So as a result of the analysis of the form, you look at how it would be used practically. So strictly speaking, the word for that should be oyo. But in common parlance, Bunkai is taken to mean the applications of the traditional forms within conflict. So I think for me, the way that a lot of modern karate ends up getting taught, and I think this is common to all martial arts, we focus on fighting each other, which is a worthwhile and valuable pursuit in and of itself. But because of that, because then karate guys are fighting karate guys, we do a lot of mid to long range kicking and punching, and all that kind of close range trapping, gripping, locking, choking, strangling, throwing, all that kind of stuff that was part of the old art gets kind of put to one side, really. So for someone who like me, who likes all of it and wants the big package, analysing the old forms can give us a window back into the old school karate. So that's essentially what Bunkai is. It's using the traditional forms that we've been bequeathed to get a glimpse into the kind of the old school methods and then kind of practice them today.
Yeah. And how does that work? So you go to a class and you as a teacher say, okay, we're going to work on Bunkai. So what does a class look like? Or how do you approach that, practically speaking?
Yeah, so I think, I've got a 4-stage model is roughly what it's based on. I think that probably is the easiest way to explain it. So what most, I think it would be fair to say, most karate people do is they do the forms as an end in themselves. So the objective of forms is to get good at doing forms, which is never the traditional way of doing it. So in my 4-stage model, I go, okay, the first thing we do is we learn the forms. So we do that. But then the next stage up, stage 2 is, well, what do those motions represent? So we then, with a partner, we'll practice, okay, this is the lock, this is the throw, this is the choke, this is what's going on with this movement. And then we'll kind of practice that. So that will be the second layer. The third layer is we say, right, it's not just showing us a specific technique. Its main purpose is an illustration of principle. So there's lots of combative concepts and ideas and principles been expressed by this movement. So let's talk about tactical positioning. Let's talk about things like leverage. Let's talk about things like unbalancing, proprioception, all those kind of things, and look at how we can expand on the example that kind of gives us, and then we'll give that kind of free rein. And then the fourth level is what I call is live experience of doing it. We'll say, well, having learnt those techniques and those combative principles and explored them, we'll now give them free rein in live practice. So in a given class, I tend to teach the forms and the partner drills and live and semi-live drills. They all kind of link together, with kata being the central hub. So as a result of that, people can sometimes, depending on what moment you walk into my class, it can look very different. So we can be hitting pads, and that will be based on the methods of kata. We can be sparring, and that will be based on the methods of kata. We can be doing flow drills, and that will be based on on the methods of kata. But it's trying to get back to that kind of kata-centric approach, really.
Okay, it sounds good. You mentioned principles. Could you give a couple of examples of principles that are applicable to the Bunkai work you mentioned?
Yeah, so a good example would be so in traditional karate they have a word like embusen, and that means kind of like the directions that you move when you do the kata. So like the floor pattern. Now, the common error on that, and it's even documented as an error way back in the 1930s, the old masters wrote, don't think of it this way because it's wrong. But people tend to think, that when you do a form, there's a guy attacking from the left, then there's a guy attacking from the right, and you're in the middle as people attack you along the compass points. That was written off as nonsense by one of the old masters. The word he uses is it's nonsense, by Kenwa Mabuni in the 1930s. What the angles in the kata are supposed to represent is the angle you assume in relation to your enemy. So whenever we're doing these movements, if a movement goes to side in the form, what it's really saying is you need to be at your enemy's side when you do this. So we would look at an example of where we're cutting that angles, and then to me there's two core principles that flow from that. You've got one is always keep the enemy in front of you, but never be in front of the enemy. So I want all of my weapons pointing at him, and I don't want his weapons pointing at me. So that's a principle. I try and position myself so he's on my center line, but I'm off his. And another principle that we would have is that we move towards what we know and away from what we don't know. So if I've made contact with the enemy's left arm, it makes sense for me to shift in that direction away from his right arm. So I'm away from what I don't know and I'm towards what I know. So these are kind of like principles. And then through the examples that the kata gives us, we like any habit, if you do it often enough, it becomes habitual. So through our kata examples and bunkai examples, we do it again and again and again and again. So these principles become intuitive, they become hardwired. So then when we practice in live and semi-live ways, then we should be using those examples to inform our movement. So that would be one example of like the principles, those two principles of tactical positioning, which are recorded in the kata through the angles that we move when we do them.
That makes perfect sense. And I come from a different background. Obviously, I did a little bit of judo and karate and jiu-jitsu. Sorry, but my main arts have always been Chinese martial arts, traditional martial arts, and for the past 20 years, mostly practical Tai Chi Chuan, so with a heavy emphasis on self-defense. And we have the same thing in some of the forms. There are parts in which you step back as you do a certain technique, but in the application you actually have to go forward. And it's the same thing that I've encountered then talking to people, and other practitioners often emphasize that, well, no, you have to do the application exactly as you see it in the form. Where I know for a fact that at the very least in our style, that's certainly not the case. And from what I've seen in many other styles, the same thing applies. The footwork that you do, the movement, the footwork patterns that you can draw in a diagram, if you like, doesn't necessarily represent the direction, like you said, that you have to go into when you apply the technique.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So because again, the word bunkai is quite useful because it literally translates as to chop into little pieces to gain understanding. So when we're looking at the form, we've got to chop it into little pieces to understand what's going on. But you've got these steps in the kata that effectively link these disparate sections together. So I call them linking steps. The foot movement itself has no direct combative application. It's just combining two unrelated sequences, if you like. And then also what most karate forms tend to do, they go so far forwards, turn around and come back the other way. And a common question I get asked is, well, what's the meaning of the turn? And I said, well, the meaning of the turn is that the sensei that designed this form couldn't afford a bigger dojo. He was going to run into the wall if he carried on moving. So he just turns around and goes back in the opposite direction. So I call it sensei couldn't afford a bigger dojo turn, So not all of them are directly combative. It's when you chop them into little pieces and say, well, okay, what's the arm position? What's the body shift? What's the angle I'm in? So, yeah, I'm sure to me, I would see this as being. I have no experience of Tai Chi, but I would imagine it would have to be the same because you're limited to how you can construct a solar form and record these things. So they're bound to have some common principles, you would think.
Yeah, there's actually a quite fun story about that in Tai Chi circles, where if I don't misremember, it's about a sword form, and at a certain point there's a jump backwards. And one of the students asks his teacher, well, why do we jump backwards? And the teacher didn't have an answer. So he goes to his teacher. He doesn't know. He goes to his teacher. And this goes on for a little while, obviously, until they can't go back anymore because the teacher passed away. But his wife is still alive. So they ask her, do you know why we do that jump backwards? He says, it's very easy. Do you remember where we used to live? And we trained there in that room. It was very small. So instead of my husband actually stabbing the sword into a wall every time he did that part of the form, everybody jumped back, and they jumped back because you could quickly then move on to the rest of the form. And I've seen this many times, stuff like that in my own style with practitioners that have interpreted things very differently from the way they were taught, and in many other styles as well, obviously. But it's actually for us, it's a part of the tradition is called a true transmission. And true transmission means that you pass on the art correctly while not holding back information or not just interpreting it any way you like. Because then stuff gets lost, or you might actually break the system and turn it into something that it was never meant to be. And that kind of leads me to my next question. So I'm guessing, I haven't kept up, but I'm guessing that you might have gotten some critique from some traditionalists every now and then. Is that fair to say?
It has happened, yes.
Okay, so I want to just let you talk a little bit about that. So how do you? I'm sure a bunch of traditionalists will then say, well, no, he's completely misinterpreting this, and you shouldn't do that to the forms, and you cannot change them. You have to keep them the way they are and pass them through the ages into time and blah blah blah. How do you react to that? What's your stance on this?
Well, the way that I well, I think you've got two kinds of traditionalists. I think you've got what are true traditionalists, in my view, and then what pseudo traditionalists. So I would regard myself as a traditionalist, even though others may not. And the way that I tend to deal with it is any conversation about that is I tend to quote the past masters back at them. So I think, so for example, with the angles, people say, well, the angles in the kata, no. My sensei told me that the guy attacks from the left and right. Well, I say, well, okay, Mabuni said that the angles in kata were not well understood. And this has led to some people saying things like, this kata moves in 8 directions, so it is for fighting 8 people, or some other such nonsense. So I go, that's Mabuni saying that. That's the founder of Shitoryu. So I tend not to argue it from my own kind of position. I just said, this is what the old masters said. And as regard that change, there's like Gichin Funakoshi, who's, regarded as the father of modern karate. He said the world changes, times change, and obviously martial arts must change too. They had built into it this idea of sensible, balanced, kind of evolution was in there. So, yeah, that's the way I tend to do it. Is if you look at traditional, it means adhering to a long-established procedure. So my argument would be, well, the longer the procedure has been established, the more traditional it is. So if I can quote back to you what the masters were saying, 80, 90, 100, 200 years ago, if you're talking to me what they've done since 1960s onwards, that's not traditional, or not as traditional.
No, that makes perfect sense. And I think you hit a really important point here, mentioning that change is an integral part of traditional martial arts. I have a friend, a dear friend, who practices a very traditional style, and they have it actually built into their procedures on adapting to changing times, adapting to how different people fight, and so on. And for instance, just to give you an example, what we have nowadays when you look back in time, over here in the West, in Europe and so on, Asian martial arts weren't all that big, and we had a strong tradition of boxing and wrestling. More boxing here in Europe maybe than wrestling. In the US it might have been a little bit the opposite, or more even. But that is what a lot of people would consider to be fighting or self-defense. And then we have martial arts that become a little bit more prevalent here, and then that becomes a little bit more ingrained here in for instance, the Netherlands. You had a huge influx of Muay Thai and kickboxing practitioners, so that changed public perception a little bit. And now you can see it in the US especially, but also in Europe, how mixed martial arts is basically becoming the default of, okay, how do you fight? Well, that's what you use. And as traditional martial artists, I think it's only sensible that you change along with that, because otherwise you become obsolete. And just quickly another point to that, and that reminds me of an interview with Dan Inosanto, and he mentioned that somebody asked him, well, why does Jeet Kune Do, the art that Bruce Lee created, have so many defenses against the sidekick? And he said, well, because back in the day, that's what everybody was throwing. Everybody was doing sidekicks. So you had to figure out how to defend against that. Nowadays, especially since, let's say, the 1980s, when it started, the Muay Thai kicking came into vogue, and that changed everything tremendously. And now you see the sidekick actually coming back a little bit again, especially in mixed martial arts. So everything changes, everything slowly changes. So, and just, tagging along with that, how do you view the way that, for instance, from your perspective with karate and bunkai, that you handle the way mixed martial artists are basically slowly becoming the norm, let's say the standard of how the average person thinks a fight should be?
Yeah, well, I don't think for the kata doesn't really address that. There are bits that do, the bits that don't. So there's two of the old masters like Itosu and Motobu were the ones who defined his because I was marking the difference between what I call consensual violence and non-consensual violence. So if someone agrees to have a fight, then that changes quite quickly, because they have an expectation of what a fight can be. They can define what a win is, all that kind of stuff. And then for the non-consensual violence, that's just somebody wants to smash somebody else's face in, and I find statistically, I mean, if you look at the crime stats, that's not varying much at all. There's no epidemic of triangle chokes or ankle locks or anything like that since the UFC started. So for my karate, I want it to cover as much as we can across the board. So the kata I put in that non-consensual violence box, and that's what that's for. And then for the fighting or the dueling or that kind of stuff, well, that would be separate, So that we've brought in elements from the judo and the boxing and all this kind of stuff to form there. But the kata kind of sits astride. I mean, there's some crossover because a throw is a throw and a lock is a lock. But in terms of their objectives, I try and keep them a little bit separate if I can.
Well, and that makes perfect sense to me. And I'm actually looking at an article that you wrote on your website, and I'll link to that in the show notes, where you list a bunch of concepts that you use in for the bunkai. And number one is all kata applications are designed to end the confrontation there and then, which is a huge difference with a mixed martial arts bout, where you can obviously if you can knock the guy out with one punch, that'd be awesome. But you have 3 to 5 5-minute rounds to construct a victory, as opposed to it's got to be over as quickly as possible, or somebody might die. Or somebody might pull a knife, or his friend might come along and hit you from behind, or whatever else bad can happen. So could you talk a little bit more about that first rule, that first concept that you put up? So applications have to end it right then and there.
Well, that's a requirement of the problem that you're dealing with, So I think one of my kind of criticisms of martial artists generally is what they tend to do is they start with a pre-packaged solution, then try and apply it to every problem. Where I think the way we should do it is the other way around. We should say, well, what's the problem, and then what's the best solution? So if I'm sparring with one of my friends, and you're right, I've got time, I can test them. We've got back and forth motion. I can feint and see what responses they come back to me with. I can try and use the training against them. We've got time. We can play that game of chess, which is an enjoyable and fun part of it. Self-defense wise, then obviously that's not the objective, because the objective isn't to win the fight. The objective is to make sure I don't get harmed. So because third parties can get involved, because weapons can get involved, because there's all kinds of legal problems and everything else, my aim is I want it finished as quickly as I possibly can. So there's no I wouldn't you're not putting up a guard, you're not bouncing back and forth with the footwork. If I can escape, then again we need live drills where we practice escaping and looking for escape. So that's the idea, because I'll forgive the quotations. Itosu, who was really old master, very influential. Modern karate is what it is because of him. In 1908, he wrote, "Karate is not intended to be used against a single adversary. It is a method of avoiding injury by using the hands and feet should one by chance be confronted by a villain or ruffian." So he's saying, the karate of his time is not for outfighting a single opponent. It's for avoiding harm in criminal scenarios, if you like. So that's why when we come to look at the kata, we need to say, well, this is the solution to that problem. Now, obviously, the cultures change a little bit and laws change, the weapons change. So there's those influences. But in terms of, the human body, human anatomy, human emotion, it's pretty much consistent.
Yeah. And I think, again, I'm in total agreement here. If you look at the context of a mixed martial arts or boxing or kickboxing match, as opposed to, like you say, self-defense. And in self-defense, it is a very good assumption to make that if there's one opponent, there's going to be a second one as well. And if there isn't, that's awesome. But if there is, at the very least, you are trying to handle such a scenario as opposed to be surprised by it. Whereas in the cage or in the ring, there's no such thing. You don't have to think about it, which completely changes the way you fight. And then the argument is always, well, you guys are saying that, mixed martial arts can't work for self-defense. That's not what we said. What you say then is, well, it's a very specific, like you say, solution to a specific problem in a very, very specific context and environment. Whereas when you change that environment and that context to self-defense and having to, all of a sudden when you're ambushed while you're walking in the street and defend yourself, well, how do you fight then? And then, okay, well, this is what I do. I'd punch the guy, fake high, go low, go to the ground and put him in an armbar. It's excellent. Okay, how do you do that when you've got your girlfriend standing there next to you? So you're going to leave her alone while the second guy is coming after her and you're lying on the ground for that armbar? Yeah, but then and then we get into this whole discussion. And the point is not the discussion, but the point is that, well, if you can accept that if one factor changes, your girlfriend's there or you're all by yourself and you fight differently, can you accept that just the mere fact that we need to take this stuff into account, small change in environment and context, huge change in the way that you have to defend yourself? And sometimes people are responsive to that, and I guess you've experienced that too, and sometimes they are not.
Yeah, well, and I think, and I get that, because I think sometimes what you've just said and what I say and people like us say is, the optimum solution will depend on the specific nature of the problem, and you need to carefully define the problem, otherwise your solution will be wrong. So, but it's not a judgment, and I think sometimes people hear the judgment. So when I'll, for example, you can use that, taking someone to the ground is not a good idea in self-defense. What people hear is ground fighting isn't good, but that's not what I've said, and I know that's, but not you've said, in a one-on-one fight, taking them to the ground and beating them there can be a highly effective way to do it. It would make absolute perfect sense to do it that way, if it's guaranteed to stay one-on-one, and if it's, the other person's agreed and there's going to be no weapons and no third parties. But if these things are a possibility, we need to factor them. And I think if martial artists were open to this, what would happen is we'd all say, right, self-defense is going to look pretty much the same for every single martial artist because we've got similar, the same problems, so we end up coming to similar solutions. And then from there, we can, judo guys want to find out who's the best thrower, and boxers want to find out who's the best puncher, and you can explore all of that and have great fun doing it. But we can just kind of focus on that self-defense box. Not everything needs to have relevance to self-defense to have value either. I do loads of things that have no value to self-defense at all, but I still find them massively enjoyable and massively rewarding.
Yeah, I'm again in total agreement. And I'm not going to go over the whole list of the article, but there's just a few points that I want to hit. And the second point you mentioned is all parts of a movement are significant. And the reason why I want to mention this is because my teacher said the same thing, but in a slightly different fashion. He says, there's no wasted movements in our forms. There's nothing that is superfluous. There's nothing that is there for no reason. And I very much agree with that. The trick is obviously then finding what the reason is. So could you talk a little bit about that? All parts of the movement are significant.
Yeah. Well, and obviously that article's aimed at, obviously, my fellow traditional karateka. And I think part of the problem comes from the way that karate has been taught from like 1950s onwards, where you've had people in lines almost like soldiers on parade. They'll do a movement. The instructor can only watch one or two people move, but he can look at the final position of everybody in the room. So he checks the final position and you need your hand forwards a little bit. You need a bit more weight on your back foot, right? Everybody moves. You can see two people move, and then he checks the end position of everyone in the room. So over time, what happens is the end position becomes the objective. So when people think about the movement, they tend not to think about how they got into that position. They just tend to think about the position. So, and therefore, when they look at the applications of it, they're saying, well, what's this move all about? They tend to look at just the final posture, and they tend to forget, well, how did your weight shift? What, not just the end position of the arms, how did the arms get there? What was that backhand doing? Why is it open? Why is it closed? And I think any good understanding of the movement should be able to explain every single part of what's going on. Whereas what we tend to find within the karate world is there's a lot of, well, just because, why do you put your hand to your shoulder before taking it away if it's just a block? Well, just because. So that's what I'm kind of trying to get people to think about there, is you need to look at the movement in its entirety. And when you do that, it all starts to make a lot more sense.
No, yeah, I agree with that. And I was just looking at another point where you mentioned number 5 is that the stances are a vital component of the techniques, where you also explain what you just said in part, is that a lot of people just look at the end position and they don't really look, well, how do you got there? How do you get there? And that is something that I teach my students because I also teach a mixed martial arts class. One of the things that is extremely hard to explain until you have your first fight, and then I'm talking about a competitive fight in the cage, is that how fatigue hits you. And one of the ways in which fatigue hits you is that you can focus on where you start with your punch or a kick. You focus on the end point, how you where your fist or your foot needs to land, but everything in between becomes really hazy, and that's where you see the big haymakers instead of the tight hooks and all that stuff. And one of the things that I try to do is address that by being, like you said, very focused on, okay, what happens in between, because that is at the very least as important as where do you start and where do you end with your technique.
Yeah, no, I agree, and that's definitely for the stances with the. My favorite quote on stances is from a guy called Genwa Nakasone, who compiled a book called Karate Do Taikan. He compiled this book in the 1920s. And Gichin Funakoshi in that book had his 20 principles of karate. I think it was the 17th, I could be wrong, but one of them was beginners use stances, advanced students use natural postures. And then when Nakasone had fleshed this out, he uses the phrase, which I absolutely love. He said, karate has many stances, it also has none. So the objective is of the stances, it's just to show a beginner how to move the weight in a given instance. But when we apply it, then we're freely moving. We're not locking into position. So I do this thing where I at seminars, which tends to people tend to like it. And when you and I met at Mark McYoung's place, I actually taught this then, and it seemed to go down well to people as well. I call it my golf swing kata. So see, if you learn to hit with a golf club, then you've got 3 essential positions for a basic golf swing. You've got the backstroke, the point of contact, and the follow-through. So you could look at those 3 individual postures, and you could freeze frame them if you wished. But when you actually hit a ball, the aim is to flow right through all those postures. So those postures are there, because if they're not, the ball will go all over the place. But you don't freeze frame on them. The movement is fluid. And as you say, it's how you're getting from one to the other that's key. And just by freeze framing those positions, it can help map the road out for beginning students. But ultimately, it's the free-flowing movement that we're after.
Yeah, I remember the workshop. I was there. I don't remember if I participated or not. I think I was a little bit late and I just watched. But indeed, and everybody really enjoyed it. And I also enjoy the analogy, like you say, the golf swing. I use a slightly different one for a similar concept, and I call it the Formula One concept. And that means that if you want to win a Formula One race, you have to go as quickly as possible, but you have to stay on the track. If you go off the track, well, you can, but you're going to be really slow. Everybody's going to pass you, so you're going to lose. And the second point is that you have to hit the checkpoints. You have to pass underneath the checkpoint so that it's still valid, and then they can measure your time. And for us in the forms, it's very similar. You have to stay on the road because and the road is curvy, and sometimes you slow down, sometimes you speed up. But you have to hit the checkpoint every single time, or it doesn't count. You get disqualified. And the checkpoint for us is the end posture. But the whole point is that, okay, you don't stop at the checkpoint. You can blast right through it at top speed, but you have to get there. And one of the key things that you see students do, and I'm sure when you teach kata, it's the same thing, is that they cut movements off to get to the next one. And
yes.
As a result, the form becomes really bad because. And then they do the opposite thing. They pause way too long at the end point, and then it becomes stilted and stiff.
Yeah, that's a brilliant analogy. I'm stealing that.
Go ahead. Go right ahead.
That's really good. Yeah, no, I agree with that completely. It works well. I like that a lot. Yeah.
Okay. Well, is there anything else that you want to mention regarding the Bunkai and your approach to that? I think we covered quite a bit of ground. Is there anything that you have a bunch of DVDs and other material and books out and so on, so I'll put a link in the show notes or on your website. But is there, for instance, like one of the videos or books, what would you recommend people who want to start learning your approach to Bunkai? Where can they start which products would you recommend? I know this is hard to do because people ask that of me also, and it's hard to say, well, start with this one because they're obviously all great. But where should they start, do you think?
Well, I think it obviously depends on what style, what forms they do, but I think the best place, if people are totally new to this and have no kind of experience of this at all, I have a free ebook on my website called An Introduction to Applied Karate, that if people sign up to the newsletter, it gives them it for free. Because that includes the points that we've been talking about, and it explains the 4-stage model and stuff. So I wrote it, I don't know what it is now, 10, 12 years ago, but it's still a kind of good overview of the approach. So I'd start there if I was people. Just if they go to my Iain Abernethy, IAIN, and sign up for the newsletter, they'll get that free ebook, and that's probably the best place for people totally new to it to begin.
Okay. Well, I just looked that up, and I made a note for including that in the show notes. So that's great, and then people can get a good sense of how to get started. All right, that's excellent. Anything else you want to add?
No. I think that we've covered those topics quite nicely, I think.
Okay, excellent. I agree. Well, if we've done that, so what I'd like to do is move on to the Q&A part. So I opened up the questions, as I tend to do, first of all, of course, to my Patreon supporters, but also on my Facebook page. So I'm just gonna shoot, and we'll see how far we get. First one is one of my patrons, Jacob Holly. He asks, what of your work would you recommend to martial artists not practicing karate? For instance, Jacob is like I am a practitioner of Tai Chi Chuan. We also have a kata, a form, but it's quite different. So is there anything of your work that you could recommend for people like us or people from other styles?
Yeah, I'll probably, again, I'll point people towards that free ebook again, I think, just to get the kind of overview. And if that seems all elementary and self-explanatory, I did a DVD a few years ago called Beyond Bunkai, which looks at the applications of Nahanshi Teki, but it's done in a semi-live way, which means that when I start moving, I have no idea what my training partner is going to do, what he's going to permit, what he's going to kill, and I have to flow to the right part of the kata. So I think a good illustration of, on that DVD, you'll see the solo form, you'll see the techniques, but you'll see how we can drill it in live ways as well. So that would be a good kind of overview and give you an idea of how rough and ready traditional karate should look when it's applied. So I'll probably head for that one. The Beyond Bunkai. There's a YouTube channel as well, of course, Practical Kata Bunkai, and there's just any amount of stuff on there. I think it's 200 plus videos. So that would be a good place for people to have an explore and see what takes the fancy on there as well.
Okay, that sounds really good. All right, then moving on to the next question. That one is from Wiebe Lindemann. Wiebe asked actually 3 questions, but we have a bunch to go through. So Wiebe, I'm sorry, but I'm just going to pick one. And I really wanted to ask you this one. I'll read it first. So it's about time management. Wiebe says, my day is full, yet somehow it doesn't seem efficient. Any advice is welcome, both from Ian's current life as a karate teacher, but also family man in your previous life, working as an electrician, job planning, life planning, how to get a job done properly, do the dishes, make your bed, and so on, all that stuff. You've got a very hectic life, and I wanted to ask you this question because many of the listeners do not appreciate how hard you work, because you put out a ton of content, a lot of content, and consistently over the years, and that takes a lot of preparation, a lot of work, just making videos sometimes, and you know what it's like. I mean, the angle is off, the lighting is off, something goes wrong on a computer, and you have to start from scratch, writing books, writing articles. It's a lot of work. So how do you plan your life so you've got good time management, so you can do all that, and obviously also have a personal life as well?
Yeah, I am just in the interest of full disclosure, I am probably not the world's most organized man. So I tend to work long hours, and I'm pretty sure that I'm not working as efficiently as I could. But my mantra, the one I try, and I don't always follow to it, but it was a friend of mine who told me this, and I just thought that's genius. Whereas he used to say, first things first, second things never. And I thought, yeah, that's the way to do it. So what I tend to do is, okay, what needs done now? What's the most important thing that needs done now? Right, everything else can wait. I'm going to do that thing. When that thing's done, right, what's the first most important thing I can do now? So there's always, priorities. So I've got I know there's 80 odd emails sitting in my inbox that haven't been answered for about a fortnight because I've been busy doing other things. I'm behind on quite a few things, but this morning I had a couple of tasks that I needed to do, so they're the first things. They're what gets done, and I'll get to everything else when I get to it. And it's the same when it comes to spending time with the family as well. So, like once we've finished this, I'm going to go for a meal with the family. I'm going to have a night with them because that's the most important thing to do at that point in time. So there's videos that need edited, and there's podcasts that need edited, and there's articles that need written. But at that point, the most important thing is spending time with Becky and Evie. So that's what I'm going to do. So that's how I try and do it. But I would hate to give the impression that I'm some kind of well-oiled, super slick machine, because that's not the way it is. I'm sure I again work very long hours. I'm sure I'm not that efficient. People who train with me regularly will tell you that I can be quite forgetful and I need reminded about things an awful lot. But I've got high work ethic, and I try and prioritise for what needs done at that given moment. And that's probably the only worthwhile advice I could give on that.
No, it's quite good, and I'll cop to the same thing that I'm also not by far not the most organized person in the world. My girlfriend will attest to that because she actually is, and I drive her nuts sometimes. Actually, what I suspect that you can do that I'm also quite good at is really focus on that one thing, and just get to the level of almost hyper focus. When you put your mind to it, that you work on it, then you're really into it, and then you can push really hard and make a lot of progress. Would that be accurate in your case?
That would definitely be true. That would definitely be true, and that's it's both it can be both a strength and a weakness, because sometimes I can get lost in the minutiae of a project and lose the big picture. You see, but being aware of that, and like you, I'm lucky to have a partner who's aware of all my foibles and failings and can kind of correct me when I'm headed down that path. But definitely when this is the job that needs done, then I'm like a dog with a bone with it. I've got it, and I'm not letting go until I'm finished.
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. And I'll quickly add a story that for Weevil. I once heard an interview with a guy. He had become a marketeer on the internet, I think, and it was really successful. And somebody asked him, okay, what's the secret of your success? And he says, well, I spent a large part of my life in the military. And one of the things that I learned there was to do the things that I really hated doing. And I got quite good at that. And so a lot of my business success is kind of like you said, okay, this is a priority. I may not enjoy this. I may really want to go play video games, but this needs to be done now, and actually develop the self-discipline to do the stuff you really don't want to do. So, and that's something that I often have to remind myself of, like, okay, no, I really want to go write that article because I've got a great idea and so on, but nope, I need to do all the boring editing part first, which I really hate, but that needs to be done because podcast has to go out tomorrow. So, and I think that might help also for Wiebe to get better at time management. So if we combine both our stories and points, I think he might find it helpful.
I would agree. I remember that's a friend of mine. I think he got it from a book. Another friend who said, if someone said to you, you've got to eat a frog tomorrow, so you've got to eat a frog. Well, you decide, well, why would you want to leave it to the end of the day? Because you just worry, the first thing you get up in the morning, you eat the frog. So his thing was, if you've got a horrible task to do that task first, and then, you can enjoy the rest of your day. And it tends to be that way with me as well, So, okay, if that's a bit I don't want to do, but that's a number one priority, then it just needs to get done. And then I can get to the things that I enjoy doing, knowing that it's done, you see.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. All right, excellent. So moving on to some of the questions that I got on my Facebook page. The first one is from Bonzi. Bonzi, I hope I pronounced that correctly because it's got an accent on the O and I don't know what to do with that. So Bonzi West, ask Iain how, as a practitioner of martial arts for both combat sports and self-protection, how he plans to separate the combat sports techniques from coming out instinctively while under the stress of a self-protection scenario.
Yeah, well, I think the thing is, I really do try and keep them as separate. I mean, if someone watches the YouTube videos, I think that comes across quite strongly, because you'll hear me say things like, this is self-defense technique, this is the fighting technique, this is what, I try and keep them separately, and we drill them separately too. So we have self-defense based drills where the objective is on, getting to safety and securing safety. And then we have fighting drills where the objective is to, beat your partner in a given way. And I think if you keep them separate, there's not that chance of the same bleed over, because the self-defense scenario is so different from a spar or a consensual fight. They're so radically different that it'd be a little like saying, if you were playing table tennis and rugby, are you likely to tackle somebody in the middle of a table tennis game? Well, I would suggest not, So you just keep them separate. And the illustration I always use for that is, I've got a friend up in Scotland who was on the Scottish, Craig Penman, who was on the Scottish national team for years, teaches sport karate, but also teaches like a self-defense side of it. And I was sitting on one of his grading panels once, and they were doing these, they came to the sparring, and he said, right, I want you to do, this self-defense based style, escapes and all that kind of stuff. And they did them just fine. He says, right, okay, now I want you to do competition style sparring. And they did that just fine. And they just jumped between the two, and not once did they mix the two up, because the practice is two separate disciplines. And I think that's the problem that people get, is when they're not quite sure what they're training for. So there's a confusion in practice. And then that obviously leads to a confusion or can lead to a confusion in application as well, I think.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's something that I also get asked, because I teach both a traditional self-defense oriented martial art, and my second class is a mixed martial art class, which is purely competition. And it's true, you have to separate them. I always separated my self-defense and traditional styles from whatever combat sport that I was training in, whether it was Sancho, Sanda back in the day, Muay Thai, kickboxing, and so on. I saw this as a completely different discipline. There's a lot of overlap, obviously, but it's like you say, it's you have to separate the two. So, like you said earlier, during the interview, is that you focus on the problem first, and then you figure out, okay, what do I need to fix that problem or to handle it, as opposed to looking at which tool do I have, and I really, really want to use this tool, even though it doesn't really fit the problem. Which is, that doesn't make sense, but okay, moving on. Next question is from Animesh Ghosh, and he asks how gross motor skills and fine motor skills correlate in terms of Bunkai practice.
Yeah, I think, but most of the motions that will survive stress are gross motor movements as well. So we can have fun learning finite little skills for the art of it. But in terms of application, it's those gross motor movements that are going to be key. But so from the kata perspective and the bunkai perspective, what we're trying to do is it's those gross motor skills, those big movements that we're looking at. We're trying to get them as efficient as we can when we do them. So we don't mean, when I say gross motor skills, I don't mean clumsy movements. I mean, it's like running is a gross motor movement, but if you look at the running technique of an Olympic athlete, that's far greater than it is when I plod along the road. So we're trying to get the highest level of skill possible, and the idea is to try and build a bit of slack into the system. So my main instructor always used to say, try and get your technique to be a 10 out of 10, because in reality it's probably going to drop to a 6. If it's already a 6, it's going to drop to a 1 or 2, or the realms of unworking. So we're trying to get a really efficient gross motor movements in training, so that when we add in the stress, it's still there and it's still functional, even though obviously it won't be as refined due to all the variables we've just introduced.
Yeah. No, makes perfect sense. Okay, I'll move on, and this is the final question. So this one is from Thomas Milbrot, and he asks, in the areas of self-defense training, but also defensive tactics, traditional martial arts often get criticized for not considering the adrenal stress response. So what would your thoughts be on that? How do you think was this addressed back in the day when the traditional systems were created? Or do you have any sources for the way of training looked at in the old days, as opposed to the more recent interpretations? So how do traditional martial arts handle that? Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think that they definitely back in the past didn't understand it as well as we do today. So the level of science we've got, the understanding of the hormonal system, the way the body responds to stress has been studied in great depth. And of course, in the modern world, that information is widely communicated and widely distributed. So if the old masters were alive today, then they'd be looking at this material that we've got nowadays and trying to work it in. So, and I would agree with the observation that most traditional martial artists don't consider it. So here in the UK during the 1990s, two of my main instructors, Jeff Thompson and Peter Constantine, they wrote about this extensively, the need to do it. And then what happened is people just started playing it lip service. So they'd say, and don't forget about the effects of fear, but they still weren't studying it to any sufficient depth. So I would say that problem still exists in the way people practice, even though they might give it a little bit of lip service now. So that would definitely something we want to be thinking about, definitely something we want to consider. The old masters didn't understand it as well as we do today because we've got the better science. However, when we look back at the stuff that the old masters used to train about, they'll talk about a mindset, the idea of they did a lot of live drills. Funakoshi, the father of modern karate, talks about practicing escaping from groups when he was a kid in Okinawa, doing live drills, kicking and punching one another, fighting to unconsciousness or submission is what he said. And he says, I can think of no better way than this to learn to defend against multiple opponents. So back in the day, they were doing practices that would introduce stress and would, as close as safety would permit, replicate live scenarios. But I think in terms of their scientific understanding of what was going on and how we can most efficiently train for that, I think we've superseded that, and we should acknowledge that, I think.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think it's, you mentioned it really, really well, is that, like you said, Funakoshi training to fight your way out of a group, and which is basically stress inoculation training. You get used to the chaotic environment of a multiple opponent scenario, and deal with it. But win or fail doesn't matter. But you deal with it, you work with it, and try to find solutions within the art that you practiced. The other thing that I would add to that is that times were different back then. We live in an age where violence is looked at as something really, really bad. I'm not going to call it positive side, but if we can agree that everybody has a right to live, then I think the logical conclusion is that everybody has a right to defend his own life, which means that using violence to defend yourself should be an integral part of it. But we live in a society in the West where this is not really accepted anymore, and you hear the whole thing of violence never solved anything, which is complete nonsense. Because if you've got somebody coming at you to gut you with a knife, well, violence is going to solve it. Not singing Kumbaya at the campfire, but I digress. But people lived in a very different society back then, where violence was a lot more prevalent, and throughout the ages, when you go back a couple hundred years in time, even here in Europe, it was a lot more violent then, and violence was just a part of life. To that degree, I think maybe people needed less of an understanding of just how dangerous things can get, and when violence is concerned. Whereas nowadays, for a lot of people, it's very academic, and it's a little bit taboo also. So you don't really need to know anymore, and you don't really want to know because it's scary. Whereas if you lived in an age where there were marauding groups just plundering the land and so on, well, you quickly survived or died and adapted. So it's like you said, they're not stupid, the masters back in the day. I'm sure they figured out that dealing with the adrenal stress response was a part of it, and maybe they didn't have the scientific explanation, but I'm sure they know what it felt like.
Oh yeah, I mean, and I think when you read their writings, you can see that. But I think part of the trouble is if you haven't got, as you say, if you haven't got that understanding and you read it, you'll miss it. You won't, because people do. If you look at the way that pretty much all of them explain, the nature of self-defense, what the objectives are, what your goals are, what's most efficient. One of the things I always find quite remarkable is that there's not the thickness of a hair between what they're saying and what modern day reality self-defense practitioners are saying either. They just use different language to express it, I think. Yeah. But I think you're right. You probably need spelled out for people a little bit more these days, which is why I think some of the scientific language can help with that.
Yeah, Well, I agree with that. And is there any book or something like you said you mentioned that when you read their writing, you have to look for it, but it's there. Any books that top of your head that you could recommend on that front?
There's loads. I mean, part of the issue with a lot of the books by the old masters, lots of it's just like here's how to make a fist and here's how to build a makiwara and the stuff like that. And then every so often when you're reading through it, there's these gems that like, oh, there we go. So like Motabu would be a good guy to look at. Motabu was a guy who he fully understood. I mean, he said nothing is more harmful to mankind than a martial art that can't work in self-defense. This is so if you check out his writings, I think the easiest probably translation is Okinawan Kempo is one of his books was translated as. I think you can find that easily enough on Amazon. I bought a hardback copy in the 1980s when they said they were going to make 2,000 of them and no more, and since then they've released it in paperback and you can just buy it at a fraction of the cost. But so you can get a paperback version of it, and that would be So I spent an absolute fortune on it for a certificate and everything else that came with it. But if you read through his writings, he gets it. And what again, there's a nice easy way for people. I did a podcast a few years ago called "The Masters Speak." And on that one, I drew out all of the kind of key, well, not all of them, but a lot of the key phrases that I thought people would find useful that the past masters had said and people would find insightful. So if they just Google my name and the Masters Speak podcast, it'll come up. Have a listen to that, and that'll direct them towards the books that, they may want to read a little bit more about those choice cuts I've pulled out for the quotations.
Okay, and I'll look that up and put that in the show notes as well if I can find it. So Thomas, you just check that out, and everybody else check that out in the show notes on my blog. Where if I can find it, I'll put all the links there where people can find it. I really I have to go listen to that podcast episode because I don't recall it. But there's actually quite a book as well called like that, if I'm not mistaken, The Master Speak. And if I'm not mistaken, it was about Charles Pranin, a well-known writer who passed away not that long ago, and it's about the Ushideshi, the students of Morihei Ueshiba before the First World War or the Second World War, who were with him in the beginning, and they talk about what it was like to train with him, and everybody wants to be how he was at the end of his life, and all about love and harmony. he was a brutal practitioner when he was younger, and he was strong as hell. And they talk about what it was like to train with that guy, and I think he understood adrenal stress quite well from what I remember of reading the book. So I think that your podcast episode might be quite interesting for people also looking into that. Excellent. All right. Before we wrap it up, Iain, what are you working on right now? What do you got any upcoming books, videos, events, anything that you want to mention?
Yeah, well, I've main project. I've got a series of DVDs that I'm working on. The first one's already out. The second two will be out soon on the throws and takedowns of old school karate. So I've broken them up by throws that lift, throws that block the path of legs, and throws that disrupt posture. People might be interested in those. In each of those, as well as showing the throw itself, I've got the photographs of the old masters doing it, references to where you can find it in the old texts. So because sometimes people think that karate doesn't have a significant throwing component, and obviously they're not as well developed as the throws of judo, but they're still nice effective throws. So that might be of interest to people. And my main project, which has been an ongoing project, is my my app. So there's an Iain Abernethy app which people will be able to find via the Google Play or the App Store. And I add to that each week. I'm really proud of that because there's just this. I mean, I don't believe it's possible for people to watch all the videos that are on there. I don't think there'd be enough hours in the day. So we just every week we add something new to it, and we've all categorized, for pad drills and fitness conditioning drills and kind of bunkai drills, general concepts, all this kind of stuff, so people can scroll through it and loads of videos on it. So that's been a labor of love for about 18 months now, and I'm really, really proud of that. So that's one of the main projects at the moment.
Yeah, I wanted to mention that because I think you're I know there's other people who've put out apps and so on, but I think the way that you're handling this one is really good because there's like you said, there's so much content in there. It's at your fingertips. You just take out your phone or your tablet and you've got it right there. You can you go to your garage to train. It's all right there. You want to grab a partner in training class. It's a really extremely practical and well done resource. So I want to recommend everybody to check that out, and I'll put the links to that in the show notes, because I really think that's taking all the advantages of the technology we have in 2018 now, and just using it to spread the information that otherwise people would have to show up at your class and seminars. That's the only other way to do it.
Well, and then that's for example, one of the sections I've got on the app is what I call the almost live section. So if I've done something in the dojo or the seminar, I think people might like that. I'll film it and throw it up on the app so people get to see what I've taught, normally within 24 hours of me teaching it. So I did one pad drill. It was some knees, elbows, and a takedown. I taught it on a Thursday night. I uploaded it onto the app first thing Friday morning. On Saturday afternoon, I got an email from a guy in Canada saying, here's my students doing your drill. And I was like, wow, you know what I mean? In the modern age, so within 48 hours, a drill that I'd taught my own students, that they just learned, it's a simple enough drill, but they just learned it 48 hours beforehand. And then it's on the other side of the Atlantic. So I thought, it's a great age we live in when it comes to learning martial arts and sharing information.
Yeah, I agree. And again, I'll put the link in the show notes, and everybody go check out the Iain's app, because it's really awesome. All right. So I think we're closing in on the 1 hour mark. Anything else you want to mention, Iain? Any last words you want to leave the listeners with?
No. Just obviously thank you for the opportunity to talk. It's nice to talk to you. And I hope there's something in that's of interest. If people have any questions around it, or there's anything that they would like more clarity on, my email address is Iain, spelled IAIN, at Iain, spelled the same way, Abernethy, ABERNETHY.com. So if it's IainAbernethy.com, and if I can help, I'll be happy to do so.
Okay. And are there any other ways that people can contact you, your site or Facebook page, or what would work best for you?
Yeah, so there's basically on Facebook, it's facebook.com/Iain Abernethy. Twitter, I'm at Iain Abernethy. Instagram is at Iain Abernethy. And the website is either iainabernethy.com or iainabernethy.co.uk. It'll take you to the same place. So that there are lots of things, lots of ways that people can get in touch. And if what I do is of interest, there's lots of ways that they can just, follow one of those, and they'll get to see all the stuff that we're putting out,
Okay, excellent. And again, I'll link to all that in the show notes so people can go there directly. All right. Well, Iain, I want to thank you very much for your time. I know you've got a lot of stuff to do, but I really appreciate the time you took to, be on the podcast and answer all the questions. I hope we can do this again sometime in the future, and I'm sure I'll get quite a lot of reactions on all the answers that you gave to the people who asked the questions. So thank you again.
Yeah, my pleasure. Loved it. Yeah, speak soon.
Okay, excellent. And we're going to wrap it up.
Thanks for listening to the Wins and Demeere podcast. For more information, go to www.winsblog.com.